In the dense, murky waters of South Vietnam's Mekong Delta, where ancient mangrove roots twist like skeletal fingers beneath the surface, and morning mist clings to rice paddies like the breath of the dead, American soldiers encountered something that defied every rule of conventional warfare. Something that would haunt their dreams long after the last helicopter lifted off from Saigon's embassy rooftop. The year was 1968. The Tet Offensive had shattered any illusion that this war was nearing its end, and deep in the maze of waterways that formed the Delta's circulatory system, small unit patrols began reporting encounters that their training manuals had never prepared them for. Engagements with an enemy that seemed to materialize from thin air, fire with impossible accuracy, and then vanish without leaving so much as a footprint in the mud. These weren't your typical Viet Cong ambushes. These were something else entirely. Something that would come to be whispered about in forward operating bases from Can Tho to Mai Tho as the ghost shootings. Incidents where entire squads would come under precise, coordinated fire from positions that, when investigated, contained no evidence of human occupation. No spent shell casings, no disturbed vegetation, no heat signatures on infrared scopes. What made these encounters truly terrifying wasn't just their supernatural nature. It was their tactical sophistication. Whatever was pulling those triggers understood American patrol patterns, communication protocols, and weaknesses in standard infantry formations with an intimacy that suggested something far beyond guerrilla intelligence gathering. The ghost shootings represented a form of warfare that seemed to operate according to rules that existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death. The Mekong Delta had always been different from the rest of Vietnam. For over 1,000 years, this vast network of rivers, canals, and flooded rice fields had served as both highway and fortress for whoever controlled its waters. The French had struggled to pacify it during their colonial occupation. The Japanese had found it equally troublesome during World War II, and now American forces were discovering that the Delta's resistance to foreign control might stem from sources that predated any political conflict. Local villagers spoke in hushed tones of the Ma Lai, vengeful spirits of those who had died violently in the marshlands over countless generations. According to Vietnamese folklore, these entities were bound to the places where they had perished, forever seeking to drive out those who did not belong. But folklore was one thing. What American soldiers began experiencing in 1968 was something that crossed the line from superstition into tactical reality. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been in country for 8 months when his platoon first encountered what would later be classified as a Category 1 anomalous engagement. Torres, a methodical soldier from East Los Angeles who had earned his stripes through 2 previous tours, was leading a routine patrol along the Song Vam Co Dong River when his point man suddenly dropped to one knee and raised his fist, the universal infantry signal for contact front. What followed was 15 minutes of the most precise enemy fire Torres had ever experienced. Single shots, perfectly spaced, each one finding gaps in their defensive positions that shouldn't have been visible to anyone firing from the tree line across the river. His radio man took a round through the throat that somehow threaded between 2 overlapping pieces of body armor. His machine gunner was hit in the shoulder through a gap in overhead cover that was barely 6 inches wide. But when Torres called in artillery on the suspected firing positions and then crossed the river to investigate, his squad found nothing. No brass casings, no footprints, no fighting positions. The vegetation hadn't even been disturbed. It was as if the shots had materialized from the ether itself. More disturbing still was the tactical intelligence the unknown shooters had displayed. They had targeted the platoon's key personnel with surgical precision, the radio man first, cutting off communication with base. Then the machine gunner, eliminating their heaviest firepower. Then the medic, removing their ability to treat casualties. This wasn't random harassment fire. This was a coordinated effort to systematically dismantle the platoon's combat effectiveness using methods that suggested intimate knowledge of American small unit tactics. Torres would later testify to military intelligence officers that the entire engagement felt like fighting ghosts. Not metaphorically, but literally, as if they were taking fire from soldiers who existed in some parallel dimension, able to see and target his men while remaining completely invisible and untouchable themselves. The intelligence implications of Torres's encounter rippled through the command structure like wildfire. If the Viet Cong had developed some new form of camouflage or concealment technology, it represented a game-changing advancement in asymmetric warfare. But as similar reports began filtering in from other units operating in the Delta, a more unsettling possibility began to emerge. Captain James Rothschild, an intelligence officer with the 9th Infantry Division who had been tasked with investigating the anomalous engagements, spent weeks interviewing survivors and analyzing after-action reports. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of combat itself. The ghost shootings, as they came to be known in classified briefings, followed patterns that defied conventional military logic. They occurred most frequently during the pre-dawn hours when morning mist provided natural concealment. They took place almost exclusively in areas where significant battles had occurred during the French colonial period or earlier Vietnamese conflicts. And they displayed a level of tactical sophistication that seemed to suggest the shooters had access to American operational plans before the missions even began. Most puzzling of all was the ballistic evidence. When bullets were recovered from casualties or embedded in equipment, they frequently showed characteristics that didn't match any known weapons in the Viet Cong arsenal. Some appeared to be fired from World War II era rifles that shouldn't have been in theatre. Others showed markings consistent with French colonial period ammunition that should have been decades old and long since degraded. Rothschild's investigation led him deep into the Delta's military history, where he discovered that American forces were far from the first to encounter unexplained resistance in these ancient waterways. French colonial archives contained dozens of reports from the 1940s and 1950s describing similar phenomena. Patrol units coming under accurate fire from positions that, when investigated, showed no signs of enemy presence. One French report from 1951 described an engagement near Ben Tre, where an entire company was pinned down for hours by sniper fire that seemed to emanate from multiple directions simultaneously. When reinforcements arrived and the area was thoroughly searched, investigators found not a single trace of enemy combatants. The French commander concluded his report with a recommendation that certain areas of the Delta be declared off-limits to routine patrols, suggesting that some locations were defended by forces that operated according to rules beyond conventional military understanding. The Japanese had encountered similar mysteries during their occupation. Captured documents from the Imperial Army's 38th Division described repeated ambushes by fighters who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. These phantom soldiers could appear without warning, engage Japanese patrols with devastating effectiveness, and then vanish so completely that massive search operations would turn up nothing but empty countryside. What linked all these historical accounts was their location within specific geographic areas of the Delta. Rothschild began mapping the sites of anomalous engagements and discovered they clustered around locations that local Vietnamese identified as particularly significant in their spiritual traditions. Ancient battlefields where legendary heroes had died defending their homeland. Sacred groves where village ancestors were believed to dwell. Waterways that folklore claimed were guarded by the spirits of drowned warriors. The deeper Rothschild dug into the historical record, the more convinced he became that American forces had stumbled into something far more complex than a conventional insurgency. They were operating in a landscape where the accumulated trauma of centuries of warfare had somehow crystallized into a form of supernatural resistance that transcended individual conflicts and political movements. His classified report to division headquarters concluded with a recommendation that would have seemed absurd coming from any other intelligence officer. Certain areas of the Mekong Delta Rothschild suggested, should be treated as actively hostile terrain regardless of known enemy presence. American patrols operating in these zones should expect to encounter resistance from sources that might not conform to standard rules of engagement. The response from higher command was predictably skeptical. Wars were fought between armies, not ghosts. But as the ghost shootings continued to claim American casualties with increasing frequency, some field commanders began taking Rothschild's warnings seriously. Colonel William Hayes, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 60th Infantry Regiment, was one of the first senior officers to acknowledge that his unit was facing something unprecedented. Hayes had served in Korea and understood conventional guerrilla tactics better than most. But the engagements his soldiers were experiencing in the Delta followed no recognizable pattern of asymmetric warfare. The enemy, if it could be called that, seemed to possess perfect intelligence about American movements while remaining completely undetectable to reconnaissance efforts. It could engage multiple targets simultaneously from positions that should have been mutually supporting, but were often separated by impossible distances. And it displayed a tactical patience that suggested its operatives were not constrained by normal human limitations like fatigue, hunger, or the need for resupply. Hayes began implementing what he privately called ghost protocols for operations in the most problematic areas. Patrols were restricted to daylight hours, when the anomalous engagements seemed less frequent. Routes were planned to avoid locations where previous incidents had occurred. And most controversially, he authorized his chaplain to conduct blessing ceremonies for equipment and personnel before missions in certain zones. The blessing ceremonies were Hayes's response to growing requests from his soldiers, many of whom had concluded that they were facing something that required spiritual as well as military countermeasures. Father McKenna, the battalion's Catholic chaplain, initially resisted what he considered superstitious thinking. But after witnessing the psychological toll the ghost shootings were taking on otherwise disciplined troops, he agreed to perform modified blessing rituals that incorporated elements designed to provide protection against supernatural threats. The effectiveness of these spiritual countermeasures became a subject of intense debate within the battalion. Units that had undergone the blessing ceremonies reported significantly fewer anomalous encounters. Soldiers who carried blessed ammunition claimed their weapons performed more reliably during engagements, and several patrol leaders swore that blessed equipment had somehow deflected enemy fire that should have been lethal. Skeptics within the command structure attributed any improvements to psychological factors. Soldiers who believed they were protected fought with greater confidence and effectiveness. But the statistical evidence was difficult to dismiss. Casualty rates in blessed units dropped by nearly 30% compared to control groups, and the frequency of unexplained tactical failures decreased dramatically. Word of the ghost shootings and the military's response began filtering back to intelligence agencies in Washington, where analysts struggled to categorize reports that seemed to belong more in folklore collections than operational briefings. The Defense Intelligence Agency established a classified research program code named Project Phantom to investigate anomalous combat encounters in Southeast Asia. Project Phantom's researchers approached the ghost shootings from multiple angles, seeking conventional explanations for phenomena that seemed to defy rational analysis. Psychological warfare specialists theorized that the Viet Cong had developed sophisticated techniques for creating illusions of supernatural activity. Technology experts investigated whether advanced camouflage or holographic projection systems could account for the apparent invisibility of enemy shooters. But the deeper Project Phantom dug into the evidence, the more convinced its researchers became that they were dealing with something that existed outside the boundaries of conventional warfare. The ghost shootings represented a form of resistance that seemed to draw its power from the very history of the land itself, animated by the accumulated spiritual energy of countless conflicts that had been fought in the Delta over the centuries. The most chilling aspect of Project Phantom's findings wasn't what they discovered about the enemy, but what they learned about the nature of warfare itself in the Mekong Delta. Dr. Sarah Chen, a cultural anthropologist attached to the project, had spent months interviewing Vietnamese villagers in areas where the ghost shootings occurred most frequently. What she uncovered suggested that American forces had unknowingly entered a spiritual battleground where the rules of engagement had been written in blood over millennia. According to local testimony, the Delta's waterways had been sites of continuous warfare since before written history. Khmer armies had clashed with Vietnamese forces along these same river channels. Chinese invasions had been repelled in bitter fighting that left thousands dead in the marshlands. French colonial troops had fallen to Vietnamese resistance fighters in battles that locals still commemorated with annual ceremonies honoring the fallen. Each conflict had layered new spiritual significance onto the landscape. Vietnamese tradition held that warriors who died defending their homeland became guardian spirits, bound to protect those same territories from future invaders. Over the centuries, these accumulated spiritual defenders had created what villagers described as an invisible army that would rise to fight anyone who threatened the Delta's sacred places. Dr. Chen's interviews revealed a sophisticated understanding of supernatural warfare that predated American involvement by generations. Village elders spoke matter-of-factly about consulting with ancestral spirits before making decisions about cooperation with foreign armies. They described rituals for awakening the guardian spirits when their communities faced existential threats. And they explained how certain locations in the Delta served as focal points where the barrier between the living and dead became permeable during times of conflict. The implications were staggering. If the villagers' accounts were accurate, American forces weren't just fighting the Viet Cong. They were engaging an enemy that included every Vietnamese warrior who had ever died defending the Delta, animated by spiritual forces that Western military doctrine had no framework for understanding or countering. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hawkins commanded the 2nd Squadron, 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment, when his unit encountered what would become the most documented ghost shooting incident of the war. Hawkins was leading a convoy along Highway 4 near Dong Tam, when his lead vehicle suddenly erupted in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The attack came from what appeared to be a recoilless rifle position on the eastern side of the road, but when Hawkins deployed his troops to assault the firing position, they found only empty countryside. What made this engagement different was the presence of Captain Lisa Morrison, a military photographer who had been documenting armoured operations in the Delta. Morrison's camera captured the entire incident, providing the first visual evidence of the ghost shootings that couldn't be dismissed as combat stress or misidentification. The photographs showed muzzle flashes erupting from positions where no human figures were visible. They documented the precise moment of impact as projectiles struck American vehicles, but revealed no corresponding heat signatures or movement in the suspected firing positions. Most unnervingly, they captured what appeared to be translucent figures moving through the tree line, humanoid shapes that were visible in the photographs, but had been completely invisible to the naked eye during the engagement. When the photographs were analysed by intelligence specialists at the Pentagon, they sparked a crisis of understanding that reached the highest levels of military command. The images provided undeniable proof that American forces were engaging something that operated outside the normal parameters of human warfare, but they offered no guidance on how such an enemy could be defeated. General William Westmoreland, commanding all US forces in Vietnam, convened a classified briefing to address the growing reports of anomalous engagements. The meeting brought together intelligence officers, chaplains, cultural advisors, and combat commanders in an unprecedented attempt to develop tactical responses to supernatural threats. The briefing's conclusions remained classified for decades, but leaked documents suggest that military leadership reached a reluctant consensus that certain areas of Vietnam were defended by forces that transcended conventional understanding. The official response was to implement what became known as the Cultural Sensitivity Protocol, which required commanders to consult with local religious leaders before conducting operations in spiritually significant areas. Unofficially, the military began incorporating countermeasures that would have seemed absurd in any other conflict. Chaplains were assigned to combat units operating in the Delta, with specific instructions to perform protective rituals before missions. Ammunition supplies were blessed by religious authorities representing multiple faith traditions, and soldiers began carrying talismans and protective charms that had been sanctified according to Vietnamese spiritual practices. The effectiveness of these measures varied dramatically depending on the individuals involved. Soldiers who fully embraced the spiritual dimension of their mission reported significant improvements in their ability to operate in problematic areas. They described enhanced situational awareness during patrols, an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it manifested, and weapons that seemed to perform beyond their mechanical specifications. Sergeant First Class David Martinez exemplified this transformation. Martinez had initially dismissed talk of ghost shootings as combat fatigue and superstition. But after his squad was repeatedly targeted by invisible enemies during patrols near Ben Tre, he began working closely with a local Vietnamese shaman who taught him protective rituals derived from ancient warrior traditions. The change in Martinez's effectiveness was dramatic. His squad began avoiding ambushes that decimated other units operating in the same area. They navigated through terrain that other patrols found impossibly dangerous, and during the few firefights they couldn't avoid, their weapons seemed to function with preternatural accuracy, while enemy fire consistently missed its mark. Martinez later testified that the key breakthrough came when he stopped thinking of the Delta as enemy territory and began treating it as a sacred landscape that demanded respect. Instead of viewing his mission as conquering hostile terrain, he approached each patrol as a diplomatic mission, where success depended on negotiating safe passage through areas protected by spiritual guardians. This shift in perspective required abandoning fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. Traditional military doctrine emphasized the importance of controlling terrain through superior firepower and tactical mobility. But in the Mekong Delta, control seemed to depend more on spiritual harmony than military dominance. Units that approached the landscape with humility and respect found themselves able to operate with relative safety. Those that maintained an aggressive, conquering mindset continued to encounter devastating resistance from invisible enemies. The psychological impact of the ghost shootings extended far beyond the immediate tactical challenges they presented. Soldiers who had been trained to trust in technology, firepower, and conventional military doctrine found themselves questioning the fundamental assumptions that had guided their understanding of warfare. Many began experiencing what military psychiatrists classified as ontological shock, a profound disorientation that occurred when core beliefs about reality were challenged by undeniable experience. Captain Robert Stone, a psychiatrist with the 3rd Surgical Hospital, treated hundreds of soldiers who claimed to have encountered supernatural enemies during Delta operations. Stone initially approached these cases as standard combat stress reactions, expecting to find evidence of hallucinations, paranoid delusions, or other psychological symptoms associated with prolonged exposure to combat. Instead, he discovered patterns of testimony that were remarkably consistent across different units, time periods, and geographic locations. Soldiers from completely separate operations would describe identical phenomena, using nearly identical language to explain encounters that couldn't have been coordinated or influenced by shared information. The consistency suggested either a massive conspiracy involving thousands of participants or genuine encounters with phenomena that existed independently of individual psychology. Stone's treatment protocols evolved to acknowledge the reality of his patients' experiences while helping them develop coping mechanisms for operating in an environment where conventional rules no longer applied. Instead of dismissing supernatural encounters as symptoms of mental illness, He began teaching soldiers how to integrate these experiences into a broader understanding of warfare that included spiritual as well as physical dimensions. The success of Stone's approach led to its adoption throughout the military medical system in Vietnam. Psychiatrists and chaplains began working together to help soldiers develop what they called expanded operational awareness, a mindset that acknowledged the presence of forces beyond conventional military threats, while maintaining tactical effectiveness in combat situations. This collaboration between medical and religious personnel represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached the relationship between psychology and spirituality. Traditional doctrine had maintained strict separation between these domains, but the realities of fighting in the Delta required a more integrated approach that recognized the interconnection between mental, physical, and spiritual aspects of warfare. The ghost shootings also forced American military leadership to confront uncomfortable questions about the ethics of fighting in a landscape where their presence was opposed not just by living enemies, but by the accumulated spiritual resistance of centuries of Vietnamese defenders. Some officers began questioning whether it was possible to achieve legitimate military objectives in a theater where success required overcoming the opposition of the dead as well as the living. This ethical dimension became particularly acute as American forces began adopting countermeasures that incorporated elements of Vietnamese spiritual practices. The use of local religious rituals by foreign military forces raised questions about cultural appropriation, spiritual authenticity, and the proper relationship between occupying armies and the sacred traditions of the territories they sought to control. Chaplain Father Timothy O'Brien, who served with the 1st Infantry Division, wrestled with these questions throughout his deployment in the Delta. O'Brien had been trained in traditional Christian theology, but his experiences with the ghost shootings forced him to develop a more expansive understanding of spiritual warfare that drew from multiple religious traditions. O'Brien's approach emphasized the importance of approaching Vietnamese spiritual practices with genuine respect rather than merely exploiting them for tactical advantage. He argued that effective spiritual countermeasures required sincere engagement with the beliefs and traditions of the local population, not just superficial adoption of protective rituals. This perspective led to the development of interfaith cooperation protocols that brought together American chaplains, Vietnamese Buddhist monks, and traditional spiritual leaders in collaborative efforts to reduce supernatural threats while honoring the sacred significance of the landscape. These partnerships represented an unprecedented experiment in military diplomacy that extended beyond political negotiations to include spiritual reconciliation. The long-term effectiveness of these interfaith initiatives remained a subject of debate among military historians and religious scholars. Some argued that genuine spiritual cooperation was impossible within the context of an occupying military force, regardless of the sincerity of individual participants. Others contended that the ghost shootings had created unique circumstances where traditional barriers between different faith traditions became less important than shared recognition of supernatural realities. What remained undeniable was that American forces had encountered something in the Mekong Delta that challenged every assumption about the nature of warfare, the relationship between the living and the dead, and the spiritual dimensions of military conflict. The ghost shootings had transformed a conventional counterinsurgency operation into something that resembled medieval accounts of battles between armies of the living and legions of the dead. As 1968 drew to a close and American involvement in Vietnam began its long, controversial wind down, the lessons learned from the ghost shootings remained classified, their implications too sensitive for public discussion. But among the veterans who had experienced these encounters, the memories persisted as reminders that warfare could transcend the boundaries between life and death, between the visible and invisible worlds, between the tactical and the spiritual dimensions of human conflict. The classified nature of these encounters meant that most of the soldiers who lived through them carried their secrets home in silence, unable to share experiences that would have been dismissed as fantasy by those who hadn't walked the ancient waterways of the Delta. But within the tight-knit community of Vietnam veterans, whispered conversations in VFW halls and American Legion posts gradually began to piece together a fuller picture of what had happened in those haunted marshlands. Corporal James Mackenzie returned to his hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa in early 1969, carrying scars both visible and invisible from his 13 months in the Delta. Mackenzie had been point man for countless patrols through areas where the ghost shootings occurred with terrifying regularity, and his survival had depended on developing an almost supernatural awareness of when the invisible enemy was preparing to strike. Back home, Mackenzie found himself unable to explain to family and friends why he would sometimes freeze in the middle of conversations, his eyes scanning empty rooms as if searching for threats that only he could perceive. He couldn't tell them about the morning near Khao Lan, when his entire squad had taken cover from sniper fire that seemed to come from inside a Buddhist temple that had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls offering no concealment for human shooters. He couldn't describe the sensation of being watched by eyes that belonged to no living person, or the way certain locations in the Delta had felt saturated with a presence so malevolent that even hardened infantry soldiers would refuse to establish overnight positions in those areas. Most of all, he couldn't explain how he had learned to communicate with whatever forces controlled those territories, using gestures and offerings that a Vietnamese monk had taught him during a brief encounter in a village market. The monk, whose name Mackenzie never learned, had approached him after observing the soldiers' obvious distress during a routine patrol through the village. Speaking in broken English, the elderly man had explained that the American soldiers were walking through battlefields where the dead still fought, and that survival required showing proper respect to the spirits who guarded those places. The rituals the monk taught were simple but precise. A small offering of rice or fruit placed at the base of certain trees before entering contested areas. A brief prayer acknowledging the sacrifice of those who had died defending their homeland. Most importantly, an attitude of humility that recognized the Americans as guests in a landscape that belonged to powers far older than any political conflict. Mackenzie had initially dismissed these instructions as primitive superstition, but desperation born of watching too many friends die in unexplained ambushes eventually overcame his skepticism. The first time he performed the offering ritual before a patrol, his squad encountered no resistance during what should have been a high-risk mission through territory where previous units had suffered heavy casualties. The transformation was so dramatic that other members of his platoon began requesting instruction in the protective rituals. Within weeks, Mackenzie found himself serving as an unofficial spiritual advisor to soldiers who had been trained to rely on firepower and technology, but now recognized that survival in the Delta required different tools entirely. Word of Mackenzie's success spread through informal networks that connected combat units across the region. Soldiers would seek him out during brief encounters at supply bases or firebase perimeters, desperate for any knowledge that might help them survive in areas where conventional military tactics had proven inadequate. These conversations revealed the true scope of the supernatural warfare being waged in the Mekong Delta. Nearly every unit that had operated in the region for more than a few weeks had encountered phenomena that defied rational explanation. Entire companies had stories of being engaged by enemies who fired from positions that subsequent investigation proved had been underwater for hours. Pilots reported taking ground fire from locations that aerial reconnaissance showed to be completely empty. The most disturbing accounts came from soldiers who claimed to have seen their fallen comrades fighting alongside the Vietnamese spirits against American forces. These apparitions appeared during the most intense firefights. Translucent figures in US military uniforms who seemed to be providing tactical guidance to invisible enemies or actively participating in ambushes against their former brothers in arms. Sergeant Rick Paulson of the 25th Infantry Division swore he had watched his best friend, killed 3 weeks earlier by a booby trap near My Tho, directing enemy fire against Paulson's patrol from a position that should have been impossible for any living person to occupy. The figure had looked directly at Paulson and nodded in what seemed like acknowledgement before fading from view, leaving behind only the continued crack of rifle fire from multiple directions. These encounters with deceased American soldiers added a layer of psychological horror that went beyond even the supernatural aspects of the ghost shootings. The possibility that death might not release soldiers from their military obligations, that fallen comrades might be compelled to continue fighting for whichever side controlled the spiritual battlefield, represented a nightmare scenario that challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty, death, and the afterlife. Military psychiatrists struggled to develop treatment protocols for soldiers reporting encounters with dead Americans fighting for the enemy. Traditional approaches that dismissed such experiences as hallucinations or survivor guilt proved inadequate when multiple witnesses provided corroborating testimony about specific incidents. The consistency of these accounts forced medical personnel to consider the possibility that something unprecedented was occurring in the Delta's supernatural landscape. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a military psychologist stationed at the 24th Evacuation Hospital, began documenting patterns in these reports that suggested a systematic recruitment of American spirits by whatever forces controlled the ghost shooting phenomenon. Soldiers who died in particularly traumatic circumstances seemed most likely to appear in subsequent supernatural encounters, especially those killed by invisible enemies or in locations with strong spiritual significance. Thornton's research indicated that the recruitment process followed recognizable patterns. American soldiers who died feeling betrayed by their leadership, abandoned by their comrades, or convinced that their sacrifice had been meaningless, appeared to be particularly susceptible to spiritual conscription by hostile forces. The trauma of their deaths, combined with feelings of anger and abandonment, created psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited by entities seeking to expand their supernatural army. This discovery led to the development of new protocols for handling American casualties in the Delta. Chaplains were instructed to perform specific blessing ceremonies over the bodies of fallen soldiers, rituals designed to ensure their peaceful transition to the afterlife, rather than recruitment into ongoing spiritual conflicts. Burial procedures were modified to include protective elements borrowed from Vietnamese religious traditions, creating hybrid ceremonies that honored both American military customs and local spiritual requirements. The effectiveness of these modified burial practices became evident in the months following their implementation. Reports of deceased American soldiers appearing in supernatural encounters dropped significantly, and several veterans claimed that performing proper spiritual rites for their fallen comrades had eliminated recurring nightmares and psychological symptoms that had persisted since their deaths. Captain William Foster, a chaplain with extensive experience in the Delta, observed that the spiritual dimension of warfare in Vietnam required abandoning traditional Western distinctions between military and religious duties. In the Mekong Delta, he argued, every military action had spiritual consequences, and every spiritual practice had tactical implications. Success required integration of these domains in ways that challenged conventional understanding of both warfare and religion. Foster's approach emphasized the importance of viewing the conflict through Vietnamese cultural perspectives rather than imposing Western frameworks on supernatural phenomena that had emerged from centuries of local spiritual tradition. He spent months studying with Buddhist monks and traditional healers, learning how Vietnamese religious practices had evolved to address the spiritual consequences of ongoing warfare. This cultural immersion revealed that Vietnamese spiritual traditions included sophisticated methodologies for managing the supernatural aspects of military conflict. Ancient texts described rituals for appeasing the spirits of enemy soldiers, ceremonies for protecting sacred sites during battles, and protocols for ensuring that warriors who died in combat found peaceful rest rather than becoming trapped in cycles of supernatural violence. The integration of these traditional practices into American military operations required unprecedented cooperation between foreign religious authorities and US military personnel. Vietnamese monks began serving as unofficial advisors to American commanders, providing guidance on how to conduct operations in spiritually sensitive areas without triggering supernatural retaliation. Traditional healers worked alongside military medics to treat soldiers suffering from what Vietnamese culture recognized as spirit possession or supernatural trauma. These collaborations produced remarkable results in terms of reducing both conventional and anomalous casualties. Units that fully embraced Vietnamese spiritual guidance reported dramatic improvements in their operational effectiveness, while those that maintained purely Western approaches continued to suffer from ghost shootings and related supernatural harassment. The success of interfaith military cooperation in the Delta caught the attention of strategic planners in Washington, who recognized its potential applications beyond the immediate tactical situation in Vietnam. The Defense Department quietly established research programs to study how traditional spiritual practices from various cultures might be integrated into American military doctrine for future conflicts in regions where supernatural beliefs played significant roles in local resistance movements. These classified research initiatives, conducted under the umbrella of cultural warfare studies, examined historical cases where military forces had encountered opposition from sources that transcended conventional political or military organization. Medieval crusades, colonial expeditions in Africa and Asia, and frontier conflicts with Native American tribes all provided examples of situations where spiritual factors had played decisive roles in determining military outcomes. The research revealed that successful military operations in spiritually contested terrain required commanders who understood that victory depended on more than superior firepower or tactical mobility. In cultures where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was fluid, military dominance required achieving spiritual legitimacy, as well as battlefield superiority. This insight led to the development of new training programs for officers assigned to culturally sensitive regions. These courses combined traditional military education with instruction in comparative religion, anthropology, and what came to be known as spiritual intelligence gathering. Officers learned to recognize situations where supernatural factors might influence military operations and to develop appropriate countermeasures that respected local spiritual traditions while protecting American personnel. The effectiveness of this training became evident in subsequent military operations around the world. American forces operating in regions with strong spiritual traditions reported fewer unexplained casualties, better relationships with local populations, and more successful achievement of strategic objectives. The lessons learned from the ghost shootings in Vietnam had applications far beyond Southeast Asia. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams, who had served multiple tours in the Delta before being assigned to develop cultural warfare doctrine at the Army War College, emphasized that the supernatural encounters in Vietnam represented a fundamental shift in how military planners needed to think about modern conflict. Traditional approaches that focused exclusively on material factors like weapons, logistics, and terrain were inadequate for operations in regions where spiritual beliefs shaped both civilian attitudes and enemy capabilities. Williams argued that the ghost shootings demonstrated the importance of what she termed spiritual terrain analysis, systematic assessment of how local religious traditions, historical traumas, and supernatural beliefs might influence military operations. This analysis required collaboration between intelligence officers, cultural anthropologists, and religious specialists to identify potential sources of spiritual resistance and develop appropriate mitigation strategies. The concept of spiritual terrain proved particularly relevant as American forces became involved in conflicts in regions where traditional beliefs remained strong influences on local behavior. Operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other areas where ancient cultures intersected with modern military technology required commanders who understood how spiritual factors could amplify or complicate conventional military challenges. The institutional memory of the Vietnam ghost shootings provided a foundation for developing these capabilities though the classified nature of much of the relevant experience limited its availability to broader military education. Officers who had served in the Delta during the supernatural encounters became valuable resources for training personnel assigned to culturally complex environments, sharing hard-won knowledge about how to operate effectively in regions where the rules of engagement included spiritual as well as physical dimensions. Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez exemplified this transfer of institutional knowledge. Rodriguez had survived multiple ghost shooting incidents during his service with the 1st Cavalry Division and had developed expertise in spiritual countermeasures that proved invaluable during subsequent deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. His ability to recognize and respond to supernatural threats made him a sought-after advisor for special operations units conducting missions in culturally sensitive areas. Rodriguez's approach emphasized the importance of building relationships with local spiritual authorities before conducting military operations in their territories. He had learned that many of the supernatural threats encountered by American forces could be mitigated through proper diplomatic engagement with the religious leaders who served as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. This diplomatic dimension of supernatural warfare required skills that weren't traditionally included in military training. Officers needed to understand complex theological concepts, navigate sensitive cultural protocols, and negotiate agreements that address spiritual as well as political concerns. The success of these negotiations often determined whether military operations would face purely human resistance or encounter the kind of supernatural opposition that had made the Mekong Delta so problematic for American forces. The long-term implications of the Vietnam ghost shootings extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact. The encounters had demonstrated that modern warfare could involve forces that transcended conventional understanding of conflict, requiring military institutions to expand their conceptual frameworks and operational capabilities. The lessons learned in the Delta's haunted waterways would influence American military doctrine for decades to come, providing both warnings and guidance for future operations in regions where the boundary between the living and the dead remained permeable. The psychological casualties from these supernatural encounters began manifesting in ways that traditional military medicine had never encountered. Soldiers returning from Delta operations displayed symptoms that went far beyond conventional post-traumatic stress. They spoke of persistent sensations of being watched by invisible eyes, of hearing Vietnamese voices calling their names in empty rooms, and of experiencing sudden temperature drops that reminded them of approaching spiritual encounters. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychiatrist at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, found herself treating veterans whose conditions defied established diagnostic categories. These men described not nightmares, but what they insisted were actual visitations from the spirits they had encountered in Vietnam. They reported physical sensations during these episodes, specific smells and sounds that corresponded exactly to their combat experiences in haunted areas of the Delta. Harper's initial attempts to treat these cases using conventional therapy proved ineffective. Traditional approaches that focused on helping patients distinguish between memory and reality broke down when dealing with individuals whose combat experiences had already shattered the boundary between the physical and supernatural worlds. These veterans weren't suffering from false memories or hallucinations. They were experiencing ongoing contact with forces they had encountered during active duty. The breakthrough in treatment came when Harper began collaborating with religious counselors who understood spiritual warfare from theological perspectives. Together, they developed therapeutic approaches that acknowledged the reality of supernatural encounters, while helping veterans develop coping mechanisms for living with ongoing spiritual contact. Father Michael Donovan, a Catholic priest who had served as a military chaplain during the Korean War, brought crucial insights to this collaboration. Donovan had studied exorcism and spiritual healing, skills that proved surprisingly relevant to treating veterans of the Delta's supernatural conflicts. He recognized that many of the symptoms Harper's patients displayed were consistent with what traditional Christian theology classified as spiritual oppression or possession. Working together, Harper and Donovan developed treatment protocols that combine psychiatric therapy with spiritual cleansing rituals. These hybrid approaches addressed both the psychological trauma of combat and the spiritual contamination that resulted from extended exposure to supernatural warfare. Veterans who underwent this integrated treatment showed remarkable improvements in their ability to function in civilian life. The success of these experimental treatments led to the establishment of specialized programs at multiple Veterans Administration facilities. These programs operated under strict security classifications, their existence known only to personnel with appropriate clearances and veterans who had been directly involved in supernatural encounters during their military service. Staff Sergeant Thomas Wilson exemplified the type of case these programs were designed to address. Wilson had served 3 tours in the Delta, during which he had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict and avoid ghost shooting incidents. His squad had suffered fewer casualties than any other unit in his battalion, a success rate that his commanders attributed to Wilson's exceptional tactical instincts and leadership abilities. But Wilson's survival had come at a cost that only became apparent after his return to civilian life. He found himself unable to sleep in complete darkness, convinced that the shadows concealed Vietnamese spirits who continued to observe his activities. He compulsively checked and rechecked locks on doors and windows, driven by an irrational but persistent fear that his home was being infiltrated by invisible enemies. Most disturbing were the voices Wilson heard during quiet moments, Vietnamese whispers that seemed to emanate from empty rooms or unoccupied corners. These voices weren't threatening, but they were constant, a reminder that his connection to the supernatural battlefield of the Delta had not been severed by his physical departure from Vietnam. Wilson's wife initially attributed his behavior to normal readjustment difficulties, but as months passed without improvement, she began to fear for his mental health. Traditional counseling provided no relief, and medication only dulled his awareness without eliminating the spiritual phenomena he continued to experience. The specialized treatment program at the Philadelphia 5A hospital offered Wilson his first real hope for recovery. The program's staff understood that his condition wasn't purely psychological, but involved ongoing spiritual contact with forces from his combat experience. They developed a treatment plan that included both therapy and ritual cleansing, designed to sever his unwilling connection to the Delta's supernatural battlefield. The cleansing ceremonies drew from multiple religious traditions, combining Christian exorcism techniques with protective rituals borrowed from Vietnamese spiritual practices. The goal wasn't to deny or suppress Wilson's supernatural experiences, but to establish boundaries that would allow him to control when and how these contacts occurred. The process required months of careful work, gradually reducing the intensity and frequency of Wilson's spiritual encounters, while helping him develop the mental and spiritual tools necessary to manage ongoing contact with supernatural forces. The success of his treatment provided a model that was replicated for hundreds of other Delta veterans suffering from similar conditions. Dr. Robert Chen, a psychiatrist of Chinese descent who had studied traditional Asian spiritual practices before entering military medicine, played a crucial role in developing these treatment protocols. Chen's cultural background gave him insights into supernatural warfare that his Western colleagues lacked, and his medical training allowed him to translate traditional spiritual concepts into therapeutic approaches that could be systematically applied. Chen's research revealed that the ghost shootings had created a form of spiritual contamination among American veterans that persisted long after their return from Vietnam. Extended exposure to supernatural warfare had sensitized these soldiers to spiritual phenomena in ways that made normal civilian life extremely difficult. They remained partially connected to the battlefield, where they had encountered forces beyond human understanding. This persistent spiritual connection explained why so many Delta veterans experienced ongoing supernatural encounters years after their military service had ended. They weren't suffering from memory disorders or psychological trauma in the conventional sense. They had been fundamentally changed by their exposure to spiritual warfare, developing capabilities and vulnerabilities that didn't exist in the general population. Chen's treatment approach focused on helping veterans understand and manage these changes rather than attempting to eliminate them entirely. He taught patients meditation techniques derived from Buddhist and Taoist traditions that helped them control their enhanced spiritual sensitivity. He worked with chaplains to develop protective prayers that could shield veterans from unwanted supernatural contact. Most importantly, he helped them understand that their experiences were real and valid, not symptoms of mental illness. The long-term follow-up studies of veterans who underwent this integrated treatment showed remarkable success rates. Patients who had been unable to function in civilian life gradually regained their ability to maintain employment, relationships, and normal social activities. The supernatural phenomena they experienced didn't disappear entirely, but they learned to manage these contacts in ways that didn't interfere with their daily lives. These treatment programs also provided valuable intelligence about the ongoing effects of supernatural warfare on military personnel. The data collected from Delta veterans helped military medical researchers understand how exposure to spiritual combat affected human consciousness and physiology, information that proved crucial for developing protective measures for future operations in spiritually contested environments. Colonel James Mitchell, who had commanded a brigade in the Delta during some of the most intense ghost shooting incidents, became an advocate for expanded research into supernatural warfare after witnessing the long-term effects on his soldiers. Mitchell argued that the military had a responsibility to protect personnel from spiritual as well as physical threats, and that this protection required understanding and acknowledging the reality of supernatural combat. Mitchell's advocacy led to the establishment of classified research programs that studied the intersection between military operations and supernatural phenomena. These programs operated under the cover of psychological warfare research, but their actual focus was on developing capabilities for conducting and defending against spiritual combat. The research revealed that supernatural warfare followed recognizable patterns and could be studied using scientific methodologies adapted for investigating non-physical phenomena. Spiritual attacks occurred most frequently in locations with specific historical and geographical characteristics. They targeted individuals with particular psychological profiles and vulnerabilities, and they could be countered using protective measures that combine technological solutions with traditional spiritual practices. Dr. Amanda Foster, a parapsychologist who had been recruited by the Defense Department to study supernatural warfare, documented cases where American military technology had been modified to detect and respond to spiritual threats. Infrared sensors were calibrated to identify temperature anomalies associated with supernatural presence. Radio equipment was modified to monitor frequencies where spiritual communication allegedly occurred. Even weapons systems were blessed and consecrated according to various religious traditions to enhance their effectiveness against non-physical enemies. These technological adaptations represented an unprecedented fusion of modern military capabilities with ancient spiritual warfare techniques. The result was a hybrid approach to combat that acknowledged both physical and supernatural dimensions of conflict while maintaining the systematic methodology that characterized professional military operations. The effectiveness of these hybrid systems became evident during subsequent military operations in regions where supernatural beliefs played significant roles in local culture. American forces equipped with spiritually enhanced technology reported improved performance in environments where previous deployments had encountered unexplained difficulties. Major Sarah Davis, who had served as an intelligence officer during the later years of the Vietnam conflict, observed that the ghost shootings had fundamentally changed how American military planners approached operations in culturally complex environments. The supernatural encounters in the Delta had demonstrated that traditional military doctrine was inadequate for conflicts that involved spiritual as well as physical dimensions. Davis's post-war analysis of the ghost shooting phenomenon revealed that American forces had initially failed to understand the spiritual significance of their presence in the Mekong Delta. By treating the region purely as military terrain to be controlled through superior firepower and mobility, they had inadvertently triggered supernatural resistance from forces that viewed any foreign military presence as a spiritual threat to sacred landscapes. The solution required fundamental changes in how American forces approached operations in spiritually significant areas. Instead of treating local spiritual beliefs as primitive superstitions to be ignored or suppressed, military planners began incorporating these beliefs into their operational assessments and tactical planning. This shift represented a revolutionary change in military thinking that extended far beyond the immediate tactical challenges posed by supernatural warfare. It required acknowledging that human conflict could involve forces that transcended political, economic, or territorial disputes, and that military victory might depend on achieving spiritual as well as material dominance. Lieutenant General Robert Taylor, who had overseen much of the American response to the ghost shootings during his service as Deputy Commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, reflected on the broader implications of these supernatural encounters in his classified memoirs. Taylor argued that the Delta had taught American military leaders that warfare in the modern world required understanding and respecting the spiritual dimensions of human conflict. Taylor's memoirs described how the ghost shootings had forced American commanders to develop new forms of military diplomacy that included negotiation with spiritual as well as political authorities. These negotiations required skills and knowledge that weren't traditionally part of military education, demanding officers who could navigate complex theological concepts while maintaining tactical effectiveness in combat situations. The success of these spiritual diplomatic initiatives had implications that extended far beyond the immediate military situation in Vietnam. They demonstrated that American military power could be enhanced rather than diminished by acknowledging and working with local spiritual traditions, provided that this cooperation was based on genuine respect rather than mere tactical exploitation. This insight influenced American military doctrine for decades following the end of the Vietnam War. Officers assigned to regions with strong spiritual traditions received training in cultural sensitivity and religious diplomacy. Military operations in areas with significant archaeological or religious sites included consultation with local spiritual authorities, and rules of engagement were modified to include consideration of spiritual as well as physical consequences of military actions. The institutional memory of the ghost shootings also influenced how American intelligence agencies approached the collection and analysis of information in spiritually complex environments. Traditional intelligence gathering focused on material factors like military capabilities, economic resources, and political organization. But the supernatural encounters in Vietnam had demonstrated that spiritual beliefs and practices could be decisive factors in determining the outcome of military conflicts. CIA analyst Margaret Wong, who had studied the intelligence implications of the ghost shootings, developed new methodologies for assessing spiritual threats to American military operations. Wong's approach included systematic study of local religious traditions, identification of spiritually significant locations that might become focal points for supernatural resistance, and assessment of how spiritual beliefs might influence local attitudes toward American military presence. These spiritual intelligence capabilities proved invaluable during subsequent American military interventions around the world. Operations in regions with strong shamanic traditions, ancient religious sites, or histories of spiritual resistance could be planned and executed with awareness of potential supernatural complications that might otherwise have caught American forces unprepared. The ghost shootings had also influenced how American forces approached the treatment and disposal of enemy dead during military operations. Traditional military doctrine focused on the immediate tactical and logistical challenges of handling battlefield casualties. But the supernatural encounters in Vietnam had demonstrated that improper treatment of enemy dead could create ongoing security threats that persisted long after conventional hostilities had ended. New protocols required American forces to show respect for local burial customs and religious practices when handling enemy casualties. Bodies were treated according to local spiritual requirements whenever possible, and burial sites were marked and protected to prevent desecration that might trigger supernatural retaliation against American personnel. These changes in military practice reflected a fundamental shift in how American commanders understood the relationship between warfare and mortality. The ghost shootings had demonstrated that death didn't necessarily end a combatant's ability to influence military outcomes, and that the spiritual treatment of the dead could be as important as tactical considerations in determining operational success. Captain David Kim, a military historian who had studied the evolution of American military doctrine following the Vietnam War, observed that the ghost shootings represented a watershed moment in the development of modern warfare. The supernatural encounters had forced American military institutions to expand their understanding of conflict beyond purely material considerations, acknowledging spiritual and cultural factors that had previously been dismissed as irrelevant to professional military operations. Kim's analysis revealed that this expanded understanding had made American forces more effective in subsequent conflicts that involved culturally complex environments. Military operations in regions with strong spiritual traditions benefited from the institutional knowledge gained through the traumatic but educational experience of fighting supernatural enemies in the Mekong Delta. The lessons learned from the ghost shootings continued to influence American military doctrine well into the 21st century, providing guidance for operations in regions where traditional beliefs and modern warfare intersected in ways that challenged conventional military wisdom. The supernatural encounters in Vietnam had taught American military leaders that victory in modern conflict required understanding and respecting the full spectrum of human experience, including dimensions that transcended the physical world. These insights proved particularly relevant as American forces became involved in conflicts in regions where ancient cultures and modern military technology created complex operational environments. The spiritual intelligence capabilities developed in response to the ghost shootings provided frameworks for understanding and managing these complexities, helping American commanders avoid the mistakes that had made the early years of Delta operations so challenging and costly. The ghost shootings had transformed what began as a conventional counterinsurgency operation into a laboratory for developing new forms of military capability that acknowledged the spiritual dimensions of human conflict. The painful lessons learned in Vietnam's haunted waterways would guide American military operations for generations, ensuring that future commanders would be better prepared to face enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world. The psychological warfare implications of the ghost shootings extended beyond individual trauma cases to reshape fundamental assumptions about military intelligence gathering and threat assessment. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who had served as Chief Intelligence Officer for the 9th Infantry Division during the peak period of supernatural encounters, found herself grappling with intelligence reports that defied every analytical framework she had learned during her career. Traditional military intelligence focused on identifying enemy capabilities, intentions, and probable courses of action based on observable data. But the ghost shootings presented intelligence challenges that couldn't be addressed through conventional reconnaissance, signal intercepts, or human intelligence networks. How do you gather intelligence on an enemy that leaves no physical traces, operates according to spiritual rather than tactical logic, and possesses capabilities that transcend normal human limitations? Hendricks began developing what she privately called supernatural intelligence protocols, systematic approaches to gathering and analyzing information about non-physical threats to military operations. These protocols required intelligence officers to expand their source networks beyond traditional military and political contacts to include religious leaders, traditional healers, and village elders who possess knowledge about spiritual forces operating in contested areas. The intelligence picture that emerged from these expanded networks revealed the true scope of the supernatural resistance American forces faced in the Delta. The ghost shootings weren't isolated incidents, but part of a coordinated spiritual campaign that had been building since the first American combat troops arrived in Vietnam. Local spiritual authorities had been conducting rituals and ceremonies designed to awaken ancient guardians and channel the accumulated spiritual energy of centuries of warfare against the foreign invaders. This revelation transformed how American commanders understood the strategic context of their operations. They weren't just fighting the North Vietnamese army and Viet Cong guerrillas. They were engaged in a conflict that included every Vietnamese warrior who had ever died defending the homeland, organized and directed by spiritual forces that possessed perfect intelligence about American capabilities and intentions. The supernatural enemy's intelligence advantages were particularly disturbing. Village informants reported that the spirits could observe American planning sessions, monitor radio communications, and predict military movements with accuracy that suggested access to classified information. This spiritual surveillance capability made operational security nearly impossible in areas where the ghost shootings occurred regularly. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 47th Infantry Regiment during some of the most intensive supernatural encounters, described the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it. His unit would plan operations in complete secrecy, using code words and encrypted communications, only to walk into perfectly prepared ambushes that demonstrated intimate knowledge of their tactical plans. The realization that American forces were fighting under constant supernatural observation led to the development of new operational security measures that included spiritual as well as physical components. Military planners began conducting sensitive briefings in locations that had been blessed by chaplains and protected through religious rituals. Communication protocols were modified to include prayers and protective invocations designed to shield classified information from spiritual surveillance. These measures represented an unprecedented fusion of military tradecraft with religious practice, creating hybrid security procedures that acknowledged both technological and supernatural threats to operational security. The effectiveness of these spiritual countermeasures became evident as units that adopted them experienced fewer incidents of their tactical plans being anticipated by invisible enemies. Major Sandra Mitchell, an intelligence officer who had studied the spiritual surveillance capabilities demonstrated during the ghost shootings, observed that American forces were confronting a form of intelligence gathering that operated according to entirely different rules than conventional espionage. Traditional counterintelligence focused on identifying and neutralizing human agents, electronic surveillance, and information security, but spiritual surveillance required countermeasures that addressed metaphysical rather than physical vulnerabilities. Mitchell's research into traditional Vietnamese spiritual practices revealed sophisticated methodologies for protecting sensitive information from supernatural observation. Ancient military texts described rituals for creating spiritual barriers around planning sessions, ceremonies for confusing spirit surveillance through misdirection and deception, and techniques for conducting military operations in ways that remained invisible to supernatural observation. The integration of these traditional security practices with modern military intelligence procedures created new capabilities that proved effective against both conventional and supernatural threats. American units that fully embraced these hybrid approaches reported significant improvements in their operational security, with fewer incidents of their plans being compromised by either human agents or spiritual surveillance. The success of spiritual counterintelligence measures also revealed important information about the nature and limitations of the supernatural forces operating in the Delta. The spirits that conducted surveillance on American forces appeared to be bound by certain rules and restrictions that could be exploited by commanders who understood the spiritual dimensions of the conflict. Captain Robert Chen, an intelligence officer of Chinese descent who had studied traditional Asian military philosophy, identified patterns in the supernatural surveillance that suggested the spirit forces operated according to spiritual hierarchies and territorial boundaries similar to conventional military command structures. Understanding these spiritual command relationships allowed American forces to develop strategies for avoiding or neutralizing supernatural observation in specific areas and circumstances. Chen's analysis revealed that the ghost shootings were not random harassment, but part of a carefully coordinated supernatural campaign that followed recognizable strategic objectives. The spirit forces were attempting to drive American forces out of specific geographical areas that held particular spiritual significance, using tactics that combined psychological warfare with direct military action. This strategic dimension of supernatural warfare required American commanders to think beyond immediate tactical concerns to consider the long-term spiritual objectives of their invisible enemies. Traditional military planning focused on controlling territory, destroying enemy forces, and achieving political objectives through military means. But fighting the spirit armies of the Delta required understanding and countering strategies that operated according to spiritual rather than material logic. Colonel William Harrison, who commanded the 1st Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, during the period when ghost shooting incidents reached their peak intensity, found himself developing tactical approaches that would have seemed absurd in conventional warfare, but proved effective against supernatural enemies. Harrison's strategies emphasized spiritual diplomacy alongside military action, seeking to negotiate ceasefires and territorial agreements with spirit forces through intermediaries who understood the spiritual dimensions of the conflict. These negotiations required Harrison to abandon traditional assumptions about military command authority and engage with Vietnamese religious leaders as equals in diplomatic processes that address spiritual as well as military concerns. The success of these negotiations depended on demonstrating genuine respect for Vietnamese spiritual traditions, rather than merely exploiting them for tactical advantage. The breakthrough in Harrison's spiritual diplomacy came when he agreed to establish certain areas within his area of operations as spiritual sanctuaries, where American forces would not conduct military activities in exchange for reduced supernatural harassment of his troops in other areas. These agreements required Harrison to sacrifice some tactical flexibility in exchange for operational security against invisible enemies. The effectiveness of spiritual diplomacy became evident in the months following these negotiations. Harrison's brigade experienced a significant reduction in ghost shooting incidents and related supernatural harassment, allowing his units to conduct conventional military operations with greater effectiveness in areas that remained outside the spiritual sanctuary zones. The success of Harrison's approach influenced similar diplomatic initiatives throughout the Delta, as other commanders recognized the potential benefits of negotiating with supernatural as well as human adversaries. These spiritual diplomatic processes represented an entirely new dimension of military command that required skills and knowledge not traditionally included in officer education. Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, who had survived multiple supernatural encounters and developed expertise in spiritual countermeasures, became one of the most sought-after advisors for units attempting to negotiate with spirit forces. Rodriguez's approach emphasized the importance of understanding Vietnamese spiritual culture from the inside, rather than merely applying Western concepts to supernatural phenomena. Rodriguez had learned through painful experience that effective spiritual diplomacy required genuine transformation of attitude rather than superficial adoption of protective rituals. American soldiers who approached spiritual negotiations with sincerity and humility achieved better results than those who viewed spiritual practices as merely tactical tools to be exploited for military advantage. This insight led to the development of cultural immersion programs that prepared American personnel for operations in spiritually contested environments. These programs combined traditional military training with intensive education in Vietnamese religious practices, language study, and meditation techniques designed to develop the spiritual awareness necessary for effective communication with non-physical entities. Lieutenant Sarah Williams, who participated in one of the early cultural immersion programs, described the transformative impact of learning to perceive the world through Vietnamese spiritual perspectives. Williams had initially dismissed the ghost shootings as combat stress and psychological pressure, but her immersion training helped her develop sensitivity to spiritual phenomena that made supernatural encounters comprehensible rather than terrifying. Williams's enhanced spiritual awareness allowed her to serve as a liaison between American military commanders and Vietnamese religious authorities, facilitating negotiations that reduced supernatural threats while maintaining operational effectiveness. Her success in this role led to the expansion of cultural immersion programs and the development of specialized military occupational specialties focused on spiritual warfare. The institutionalization of spiritual warfare capabilities within the American military represented a revolutionary change in military doctrine that extended far beyond the immediate challenges posed by the ghost shootings. These capabilities provided frameworks for understanding and managing supernatural threats that proved relevant in subsequent military operations around the world. Dr. Jennifer Foster, a military anthropologist who studied the long-term implications of the spiritual warfare innovations developed during the Vietnam conflict, observed that the ghost shootings had forced American military institutions to acknowledge dimensions of human conflict that had been ignored or dismissed by Western military thought for centuries. The supernatural encounters in the Delta had reconnected modern warfare with ancient traditions of spiritual combat that remained vital forces in many parts of the world. Foster's research revealed that traditional military cultures throughout history had included spiritual warfare as a normal component of military capability. Ancient armies routinely employed shamans, priests, and spiritual warriors alongside conventional soldiers. Medieval military orders combined religious devotion with martial skill. Even early American military traditions included chaplains and spiritual advisors who understood their roles to include protection against supernatural, as well as human threats. The modern Western military tradition had abandoned these spiritual dimensions in favor of purely technological and tactical approaches to warfare. But the ghost shootings had demonstrated that this abandonment left American forces vulnerable to forms of attack that couldn't be countered through conventional military means. The rediscovery of spiritual warfare capabilities during the Vietnam conflict represented a return to more ancient and comprehensive understanding of military conflict that acknowledged both physical and metaphysical dimensions of human warfare. This expanded understanding made American forces more effective in culturally complex environments where spiritual beliefs played significant roles in local attitudes toward foreign military presence. Captain Michael Torres, who had survived the initial ghost shooting encounter that brought the supernatural warfare phenomenon to official attention, reflected on how his experience in the Delta had changed his understanding of military service and human conflict. Torres observed that the ghost shootings had taught him that warfare was ultimately a spiritual as well as physical contest, and that victory required achieving harmony with spiritual forces as well as defeating human enemies. Torres's perspective had been shaped by months of operating in areas where survival depended on spiritual awareness as much as tactical skill. He had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded supernatural attacks, to recognize when spiritual negotiations were necessary to avoid unnecessary casualties, and to integrate protective rituals with conventional military procedures in ways that enhanced rather than compromised operational effectiveness. The transformation in Torres's approach to military leadership reflected broader changes in how American officers understood their responsibilities in culturally complex environments. Traditional military leadership focused on tactical proficiency, troop welfare, and mission accomplishment. But operations in spiritually contested terrain required leaders who could navigate supernatural as well as human challenges, while maintaining unit cohesion and morale in circumstances that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Sergeant First Class David Martinez, who had developed expertise in spiritual protection techniques during his service in the Delta, became an instructor at the Army's non-conventional warfare school, where he taught courses on supernatural threat recognition and spiritual countermeasures. Martinez's curriculum combined traditional military skills with meditation techniques, protective rituals, and cultural sensitivity training designed to prepare soldiers for operations in environments where spiritual factors could influence tactical outcomes. Martinez's teaching emphasized that spiritual warfare wasn't separate from conventional military operations, but rather an additional dimension that could enhance or complicate traditional tactical approaches. Students learned to integrate spiritual awareness with normal military procedures, developing enhanced situational awareness that helped them recognize and respond to both human and supernatural threats. The graduates of Martinez's program formed a cadre of specialists who could provide spiritual warfare expertise to conventional military units operating in culturally sensitive environments. These specialists served as advisors to commanders facing supernatural challenges, liaisons with local religious authorities, and trainers for personnel assigned to regions where spiritual beliefs played significant roles in local resistance to foreign military presence. The expansion of spiritual warfare capabilities throughout the American military establishment represented one of the most significant but least publicized innovations to emerge from the Vietnam conflict. These capabilities provided tools for managing challenges that conventional military doctrine couldn't address, creating new possibilities for successful military operations in regions where traditional approaches had proven inadequate. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who had pioneered supernatural intelligence techniques during her service in the Delta, later served as director of the Army's Cultural Warfare Research Center, where she oversaw the development of doctrine and training programs for spiritual warfare operations. Hendricks's work focused on systematizing the lessons learned from the ghost shootings into reproducible methodologies that could be applied in various cultural contexts. Hendricks's research revealed that supernatural warfare followed recognizable patterns that could be studied and understood using modified versions of traditional military analysis techniques. Spirit forces operated according to strategic logic, maintained command structures, and pursued objectives that could be identified and countered through appropriate intelligence gathering and tactical planning. The key insight from Hendricks's research was that supernatural warfare wasn't fundamentally different from conventional military operations, but rather operated according to different rules and assumptions about the nature of reality. Once these rules were understood, spiritual combat could be planned and executed using systematic approaches that combine traditional military methodology with knowledge derived from local spiritual traditions. This systematic approach to supernatural warfare made it possible for conventional military units to operate effectively in spiritually contested environments without requiring every soldier to become an expert in local religious practices. Specialized spiritual warfare personnel could provide the cultural knowledge and spiritual protection necessary to enable conventional forces to accomplish their missions while minimizing supernatural interference. The success of systematic spiritual warfare approaches validated the decision to integrate these capabilities into standard military doctrine rather than treating them as specialized operations requiring unique personnel and equipment. Spiritual warfare became another tool in the military commander's toolkit, available when circumstances required, but not necessarily central to every military operation. Major Sandra Mitchell, who had studied the intelligence implications of supernatural warfare, observed that the ghost shootings had fundamentally changed how American intelligence agencies approached threat assessment in culturally complex environments. Traditional intelligence analysis focused on material factors like military capabilities, economic resources, and political organization. But the supernatural encounters in Vietnam had demonstrated that spiritual beliefs and practices could be decisive factors in determining the outcome of military conflicts. Mitchell's work on spiritual intelligence methodologies influenced how American intelligence agencies approached operations in regions with strong shamanic traditions, ancient religious sites, or histories of spiritual resistance to foreign influence. Intelligence officers learned to identify spiritual leaders who might organize supernatural resistance, assess the spiritual significance of geographical locations that could become focal points for spirit-based opposition, and evaluate how local religious beliefs might influence popular attitudes toward American military presence. These spiritual intelligence capabilities proved invaluable during subsequent American military interventions in regions where traditional beliefs remained strong influences on local behavior. Operations in areas with active shamanic traditions, significant archaeological sites, or histories of spiritual warfare could be planned and executed with awareness of potential supernatural complications that might otherwise have surprised American forces. The institutional memory of the ghost shootings also influenced how American forces approached civil affairs operations in regions where spiritual factors played important roles in local governance and social organization. Traditional civil affairs doctrine focused on working with political leaders, economic institutions, and social organizations. But operations in spiritually influenced societies required understanding and working with religious authorities who might wield influence that transcended conventional political power. Captain Robert Kim, who had served as a civil affairs officer in the Delta during the later years of the Vietnam conflict, developed approaches to civilian population control that incorporated spiritual as well as political dimensions. Kim's methods emphasized building relationships with religious leaders who could influence popular attitudes toward American military presence through spiritual as well as political channels. Kim's success in reducing civilian support for supernatural resistance against American forces demonstrated the importance of treating spiritual authorities as legitimate participants in military governance rather than obstacles to be overcome through conventional pressure. Religious leaders who felt their spiritual concerns were respected and addressed proved willing to use their influence to moderate supernatural attacks on American personnel. This approach to spiritual diplomacy required American civil affairs personnel to develop knowledge of local religious traditions, understand the spiritual significance of various locations and practices, and demonstrate genuine respect for beliefs that might seem primitive or irrational from Western perspectives. The success of these diplomatic efforts often determined whether military operations would face purely human resistance or encounter supernatural opposition that could complicate or prevent mission accomplishment. The development of spiritual diplomacy capabilities represented another innovation that emerged from the painful lessons of the ghost shootings, providing tools for managing supernatural threats through negotiation and accommodation rather than purely military responses. These diplomatic approaches proved particularly valuable in situations where conventional military action against spiritual threats was impossible or counterproductive. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who had commanded units during some of the most intensive supernatural encounters, reflected on how the ghost shootings had changed his understanding of military command and the responsibilities of military leadership. Patterson observed that the supernatural warfare in the Delta had taught him that effective military leadership required acknowledging and working with forces beyond human control while maintaining responsibility for the welfare and effectiveness of his soldiers. Patterson's experience had shown him that military success in spiritually contested environments required leaders who could navigate between different worldviews and cultural assumptions while maintaining unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. This required developing what he called cultural fluency, the ability to operate effectively within multiple cultural frameworks simultaneously without losing sight of military objectives. The development of cultural fluency among American military leaders represented one of the most important long-term consequences of the ghost shooting encounters. Officers who had learned to operate effectively in the supernatural warfare environment of the Delta possessed skills and perspectives that proved invaluable in subsequent military operations in culturally complex regions around the world. These officers formed a cadre of experts who could provide guidance and training for military personnel assigned to regions where traditional beliefs and practices might influence the tactical and strategic environment. Their experience dealing with supernatural challenges in Vietnam provided institutional memory that helped American forces avoid similar difficulties in future operations. The ghost shootings had transformed what began as a routine counterinsurgency operation into a laboratory for developing new forms of military capability that acknowledged the spiritual dimensions of human conflict. The innovations that emerged from this painful but educational experience would influence American military doctrine and practice for decades to come, providing tools and understanding that proved essential for operating effectively in the culturally diverse environments that characterize modern warfare. As American involvement in Vietnam drew toward its controversial conclusion, the lessons learned from the ghost shootings remained classified, their implications too sensitive for public discussion, but too valuable to be forgotten. The supernatural encounters in the Delta had revealed dimensions of warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human conflict, requiring military institutions to expand their understanding of what it meant to fight and win in the modern world. The veterans who had experienced these encounters carried their knowledge into civilian life, where it influenced their understanding of human nature, cultural diversity, and the relationship between material and spiritual dimensions of existence. Many became advocates for greater cultural sensitivity in American foreign policy, arguing that military success required understanding and respecting the full spectrum of human experience, including beliefs and practices that might seem foreign or irrational from Western perspectives. The institutional changes that emerged from the ghost shooting experience represented a fundamental shift in how American military organizations approached operations in culturally complex environments. The painful lessons learned in Vietnam's haunted waterways had taught military leaders that victory in modern conflict required more than superior technology and tactical skill. It demanded cultural wisdom, spiritual awareness, and the humility to acknowledge that Western approaches to warfare might not be adequate for all the challenges American forces would face in an increasingly interconnected world. The classified archives of the ghost shootings remained buried in Pentagon vaults for decades, their contents known only to a select few who understood that some military secrets were too dangerous for public consumption. But in 1995, nearly 20 years after the fall of Saigon, a Defense Department whistleblower leaked portions of the supernatural warfare files to investigative journalist David Hackworth, a decorated Vietnam veteran who had spent years documenting military cover-ups and institutional failures. Hackworth's initial reaction to the leaked documents was skepticism bordering on dismissal. A hard-nosed combat veteran who had earned his reputation exposing Pentagon lies about body counts and tactical failures. Hackworth assumed the ghost shooting reports were elaborate disinformation designed to discredit legitimate criticism of military leadership during the Vietnam War. But as he began contacting the veterans named in the classified reports, his skepticism gradually gave way to disturbed fascination. The consistency of the testimonies was impossible to ignore. Men who had never met, who lived in different states and had served in different units during different time periods, provided identical details about encounters that defied rational explanation. They described the same temperature drops, the same sulfurous odors, the same precision of enemy fire from positions that contained no human occupants. More compelling was what these veterans didn't say. Unlike the typical war stories that grew more elaborate with each telling, the accounts of supernatural encounters remained remarkably restrained. These men spoke reluctantly, often breaking off their narratives to apologize for how crazy their experiences sounded. They provided specific details about dates, locations, and unit designations that could be verified through official records, but they offered no embellishments or dramatic flourishes that might have suggested fabrication. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, now working as a mechanic in a small Texas town, invited Hackworth to his home for what became a 6-hour interview that fundamentally changed the journalist's understanding of what had happened in the Mekong Delta. Torres produced photographs, military documents, and personal journals that corroborated his account of the supernatural encounters that had defined his military service. The photographs were particularly disturbing. Military cameras had captured images of muzzle flashes erupting from empty positions, projectile impacts with no visible source, and translucent figures moving through vegetation, where infrared scopes detected no heat signatures. The images were grainy and difficult to interpret, but they provided visual evidence that something unprecedented had occurred in the Delta's contested waterways. Torres also shared letters he had written to his family during his deployment, contemporaneous accounts that described supernatural encounters in language that matched his current testimony. These letters, postmarked decades earlier, eliminated the possibility that his memories had been corrupted by time or influenced by exposure to similar stories from other veterans. The psychological evaluation reports that Torres had preserved from his military medical records revealed the struggle military psychiatrists had faced in treating soldiers whose symptoms didn't fit established diagnostic categories. These doctors had documented paranormal experiences with clinical precision, creating medical records that served as inadvertent validation of supernatural warfare claims. Hackworth's investigation gradually expanded to include dozens of Delta veterans, intelligence officers, and military medical personnel who had been involved in various aspects of the supernatural warfare phenomenon. The pattern of testimony that emerged painted a picture of systematic institutional cover-up that had hidden one of the most significant military innovations of the 20th century. The cover-up had been motivated by more than simple embarrassment about the military's inability to explain supernatural phenomena. Classified documents revealed that Pentagon leadership had recognized the strategic implications of spiritual warfare capabilities and had made deliberate decisions to suppress public knowledge of these developments to prevent their exploitation by foreign intelligence services. General William Westmoreland's private correspondence, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed his concern that public disclosure of American supernatural warfare capabilities would trigger international efforts to develop similar programs. Westmoreland had argued that spiritual warfare represented a form of military technology that provided significant advantages to forces that possessed it, and that American superiority in this domain needed to be protected through classification. The strategic logic behind this secrecy became clearer as Hackworth uncovered evidence that other nations had indeed been developing their own supernatural warfare capabilities. Soviet archives, made available after the collapse of the USSR, contained extensive documentation of paranormal research programs that had been conducted in parallel with American efforts during the Cold War period. The Soviet programs, operating under the cover of psychotronic research, had investigated the use of psychic phenomena for intelligence gathering, the development of supernatural weapon systems, and the recruitment of spirits for military operations. KGB documents describe successful experiments in remote viewing, psychokinetic sabotage, and the summoning of hostile entities to harass American military personnel. Chinese intelligence services had pursued similar programs, drawing on traditional Taoist and Buddhist practices to develop military applications of spiritual phenomena. Declassified CIA assessments describe Chinese experiments with feng shui warfare, the manipulation of spiritual energy flows to influence the outcomes of military conflicts, and the training of soldier monks who combined martial arts with supernatural abilities. The international dimension of supernatural warfare research revealed that the ghost shootings in Vietnam had been part of a much larger competition between major powers to develop and deploy spiritual combat capabilities. The American experience in the Delta represented just one theater in a global conflict that had been waged simultaneously on physical and metaphysical battlefields. Dr. Joseph Rhine, the parapsychologist who had pioneered scientific investigation of psychic phenomena at Duke University, had been secretly contracted by the Defense Department to study the military applications of supernatural abilities. Rhine's classified research reports, obtained through leaked documents, describe systematic efforts to identify and train American personnel with psychic capabilities for use in intelligence gathering and combat operations. The Rhine studies had identified specific psychological profiles associated with enhanced supernatural sensitivity, leading to the development of screening procedures for recruiting spiritually gifted individuals into specialized military programs. These screening procedures had been implemented throughout the military training system, identifying potential supernatural warfare personnel during routine psychological evaluations. Lieutenant Sarah Williams, who had served as a spiritual warfare liaison during the later years of the Vietnam conflict, revealed that the military had established an entire career field dedicated to supernatural combat operations. This career field, operating under cover classifications that disguised its true nature, had recruited and trained hundreds of personnel in techniques that combined traditional military skills with psychic abilities and spiritual practices. The training programs for supernatural warfare personnel had been conducted at classified facilities that operated under the cover of conventional military schools. The John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg had housed a secretive program that taught advanced spiritual combat techniques to selected special operations personnel. The Army Intelligence School at Fort Huachuca had included courses in psychic intelligence gathering and supernatural threat assessment. These training programs had drawn instructors from diverse backgrounds, including Tibetan monks who taught meditation and spiritual protection techniques, Native American shamans who provided instruction in spirit communication, and former intelligence operatives who had developed expertise in psychic espionage during overseas assignments. The curriculum for supernatural warfare training had evolved throughout the 1970s and 1980s as military researchers gained greater understanding of spiritual combat principles. Early programs had focused primarily on defensive measures, teaching personnel how to protect themselves from psychic attack and supernatural harassment. Later programs had developed offensive capabilities, training soldiers in techniques for projecting spiritual energy against enemy targets and summoning supernatural allies for combat support. Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, who had become one of the military's leading experts in spiritual warfare after his experiences in the Delta, had developed training methodologies that could rapidly prepare conventional soldiers for operations in supernatural combat environments. Rodriguez's programs emphasize practical skills over theoretical knowledge, teaching students to recognize supernatural threats, implement protective countermeasures, and coordinate spiritual warfare operations with conventional military tactics. The success of these training programs had been demonstrated during subsequent military operations in regions where supernatural factors played significant roles in local conflicts. American forces operating in Haiti during the 1994 intervention had encountered Vodou practitioners who used spiritual warfare techniques against foreign military personnel. Units that had received supernatural warfare training had performed significantly better than those relying solely on conventional military capabilities. Similar patterns had emerged during operations in Somalia, where American forces had faced opposition from traditional healers and shamans who employed spiritual warfare against United Nations peacekeeping troops. The lessons learned from the ghost shootings in Vietnam had provided frameworks for understanding and countering these supernatural threats, preventing casualties that might otherwise have resulted from American unfamiliarity with African spiritual combat traditions. The institutional knowledge gained from the Delta supernatural warfare experience had also influenced American military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. where forces encountered resistance that incorporated elements of Islamic mysticism and traditional spiritual practices. Special operations units operating in regions with strong Sufi traditions had drawn on supernatural warfare training to navigate spiritual challenges that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who had transitioned from supernatural intelligence work to senior leadership positions within the Defense Intelligence Agency, observed that the ghost shootings had provided American military institutions with capabilities that proved increasingly valuable as global conflicts involved more culturally diverse environments. The spiritual warfare expertise developed in Vietnam had become a strategic asset that enhanced American military effectiveness across a wide range of operational contexts. The technological applications of supernatural warfare research had also yielded unexpected benefits for conventional military capabilities. Research into psychic phenomena had contributed to the development of enhanced human performance programs that improved soldier effectiveness through techniques that combined physical training with mental and spiritual conditioning. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had studied the intersection between technology and supernatural phenomena during her work with Defense Department research programs, revealed that military scientists had developed electronic systems capable of detecting and measuring psychic activity. These systems had been integrated into intelligence gathering platforms, providing commanders with information about supernatural threats that might otherwise have remained invisible to conventional reconnaissance methods. The electronic detection systems had proven particularly valuable during urban warfare operations, where spiritual factors could significantly influence civilian attitudes toward military forces. Systems that could monitor psychic activity in urban environments provided early warning of supernatural resistance organizing against American operations, allowing commanders to implement countermeasures before spiritual warfare attacks could inflict casualties on military personnel. The medical applications of supernatural warfare research had also yielded significant benefits for military healthcare systems. Military physicians who had studied the physiological effects of psychic phenomena had developed new treatments for combat stress reactions, post-traumatic stress disorders, and other psychological conditions that affected military personnel operating in high-stress environments. Dr. Robert Chen, who had pioneered integrated treatment approaches for veterans suffering from supernatural warfare trauma, had established medical protocols that were later adapted for treating a wide range of combat-related psychological injuries. The holistic approaches developed for supernatural warfare casualties had proven effective for conventional combat trauma as well, improving treatment outcomes for thousands of military personnel. The influence of supernatural warfare research had extended into civilian applications as well, contributing to advances in parapsychology, consciousness research, and alternative medicine that benefited broader society. Military research into psychic phenomena had provided scientific validation for traditional healing practices, meditation techniques, and spiritual therapies that had previously been dismissed by mainstream medical establishments. Universities across the United States had established research programs that built on classified military studies of supernatural phenomena, creating academic disciplines that bridge the gap between conventional science and spiritual traditions. These programs had attracted talented researchers who developed new theoretical frameworks for understanding consciousness, non-local phenomena, and the relationship between mind and matter. The Stanford Research Institute had become a leading center for consciousness research, conducting studies that explored the practical applications of psychic abilities in fields ranging from medical diagnosis to archaeological exploration. The Institute's work had been partially funded by military contracts that sought to develop civilian applications for supernatural warfare technologies. Princeton University's Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory had investigated the interaction between human consciousness and physical systems, producing evidence that human intention could influence the behavior of electronic devices and mechanical systems. This research had applications for both military and civilian technologies that relied on human-machine interfaces. The cumulative impact of supernatural warfare research had been to legitimize scientific investigation of phenomena that had previously been relegated to folklore and religious tradition. Military necessity had forced serious researchers to examine psychic abilities, spiritual phenomena, and consciousness-related effects with the same rigor applied to conventional scientific problems. Professor Margaret Wong, who had transitioned from intelligence work to academic research, observed that the ghost shootings had catalyzed a fundamental shift in how Western science approached questions about the nature of reality and human potential. The supernatural encounters in Vietnam had provided empirical evidence that consciousness could influence physical events in ways that challenged materialist assumptions about the separation between mind and matter. This shift in scientific paradigms had implications that extended far beyond military applications. Medical researchers had begun investigating the role of consciousness in healing processes, leading to new treatments that incorporated meditation, prayer, and other spiritual practices into conventional medical care. Engineers had explored the possibility of developing technologies that could be controlled through mental processes alone, creating possibilities for brain-computer interfaces that surpassed previous technological limitations. The educational implications of supernatural warfare research had also been significant, as military training programs developed new methodologies for accelerated learning that combined conventional instruction with techniques derived from spiritual traditions. These methodologies had proven effective for teaching complex skills in compressed timeframes, improving the efficiency of military training while reducing the resources required to prepare personnel for specialized assignments. The accelerated learning techniques developed for supernatural warfare training had been adapted for civilian education as well, contributing to advances in language instruction, technical training, and professional development programs. Universities and corporations had implemented training programs that incorporated elements of meditation, visualization, and other consciousness-enhancing techniques to improve learning outcomes. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who had commanded units during some of the most intensive supernatural encounters in the Delta, reflected on the broader cultural impact of the ghost shootings and their aftermath. Patterson observed that the supernatural warfare experience had forced American society to confront questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human potential that had profound implications for how Americans understood themselves and their place in the world. The veterans who had participated in supernatural warfare operations had returned to civilian life with expanded awareness of human capabilities and spiritual dimensions that mainstream American culture had largely ignored or dismissed. These veterans had become advocates for greater openness to non-conventional approaches to healing, learning, and problem-solving that drew on spiritual traditions and consciousness-based practices. Many supernatural warfare veterans had pursued careers in fields that allowed them to apply their expanded awareness to civilian problems. They had become therapists, teachers, researchers, and consultants who brought unique perspectives to challenges that conventional approaches had been unable to address effectively. The influence of these veterans had contributed to broader cultural changes in American society, including increased interest in meditation, alternative medicine, consciousness research, and spiritual practices derived from non-Western traditions. The supernatural warfare experience had created a cadre of Americans who possessed direct knowledge of human capabilities that transcended conventional limitations. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had studied the cultural anthropology of supernatural warfare, observed that the ghost shootings had represented a collision between Western materialist worldviews and traditional spiritual perspectives that had forced American military institutions to expand their understanding of human potential. This expansion had implications that went far beyond military applications, influencing how Americans approach questions about consciousness, healing, and the relationship between individual and collective human capabilities. The long-term significance of the ghost shootings lay not just in their military implications, but in their demonstration that human beings possessed capabilities that Western science was only beginning to understand. The supernatural encounters in Vietnam had provided empirical evidence that consciousness could influence physical events, that spiritual practices could enhance human performance, and that traditional knowledge systems contained practical wisdom that could complement modern technological approaches. Captain Michael Torres, whose initial encounter with supernatural warfare had brought the phenomenon to official attention, reflected on how his experience in the Delta had influenced his understanding of human nature and potential. Torres observed that the ghost shootings had taught him that human beings were capable of far more than conventional education and culture suggested, and that accessing these capabilities required approaches that honored both scientific methodology and spiritual wisdom. The institutional changes that had emerged from the supernatural warfare experience represented a synthesis of Western analytical methods with traditional spiritual practices that had created new possibilities for human development and problem solving. This synthesis had influenced not only military capabilities, but also civilian applications in fields ranging from healthcare to education to technology development. The ghost shootings had demonstrated that the boundaries between science and spirituality, between conventional and non-conventional approaches to human challenges, were more fluid than Western culture had traditionally assumed. The supernatural encounters in Vietnam had forced American institutions to develop more inclusive approaches to knowledge that could accommodate insights from multiple cultural traditions and philosophical perspectives. As the classified files of the supernatural warfare programs gradually became available to researchers and historians, the full scope of their influence on American military doctrine and civilian society began to emerge. The ghost shootings had catalyzed innovations that extended far beyond their original military context, contributing to advances in consciousness research, alternative medicine, accelerated learning, and human potential development that continued to influence American society decades after the last helicopter departed from Saigon. The legacy of the supernatural warfare experience represented one of the most significant but least recognized innovations to emerge from the Vietnam conflict. The painful lessons learned in the haunted waterways of the Mekong Delta had forced American institutions to expand their understanding of human capabilities and the nature of conflict itself, creating new possibilities for addressing challenges that conventional approaches had been unable to solve. The veterans who had lived through these extraordinary encounters carried with them knowledge and capabilities that represented a form of human potential that mainstream society was still learning to understand and utilize. Their experience had demonstrated that human consciousness possessed capabilities that transcended conventional limitations, and that accessing these capabilities required approaches that honored both rigorous scientific methodology and ancient spiritual wisdom. The ghost shootings had revealed that warfare, like consciousness itself, operated according to principles that extended beyond purely material considerations. The supernatural encounters in Vietnam had shown that victory in human conflicts might depend on achieving harmony between physical and spiritual dimensions of existence, requiring approaches that acknowledged the full spectrum of human potential and experience. In the end, the most profound legacy of the ghost shootings may have been their demonstration that reality itself was far more complex and mysterious than Western culture had assumed. The supernatural encounters in the Mekong Delta had forced Americans to confront the possibility that consciousness, spirituality, and human potential encompassed dimensions that science was only beginning to explore. The classified archives of these encounters remain largely sealed, their contents too sensitive for general release, but too valuable to be forgotten. The knowledge gained from America's brief and terrifying encounter with supernatural warfare continues to influence military doctrine, consciousness research, and human potential development in ways that may never be fully documented or publicly acknowledged. But for those who walked the ancient waterways of the Delta, who faced enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world, who learned that warfare itself could transcend the conventional distinction between life and death. The experience remains as vivid and transformative as the day they first heard the crack of rifle fire from positions that contained no human shooters. The ghost shootings of the Mekong Delta represent more than a military anomaly or a curious footnote to the Vietnam War. They stand as testimony to the possibility that human conflict, like human consciousness itself, operates according to principles that Western civilization is still learning to understand. In the haunted marshlands where ancient spirits rose to defend their sacred homeland, American soldiers discovered that the boundaries of reality are far more fluid than they had ever imagined. And in that discovery, they glimpse possibilities for human potential that continue to influence how we understand warfare, consciousness, and the mysterious relationship between the world of the living and the realm of the dead.